There is a small indentation in the calcified silt of a South African coastline, preserved for 1,000 centuries. It is a footprint. The arch is high, the toes are splayed, and the heel is pressed deep into what was once wet sand. It belongs to a child, no more than 7 years old, who paused for a moment to look at the sea. We look at this mark and see a ghost. We see a primitive ancestor, a flickering shadow in the long hallway of time. We assume their lives were a chaotic blur of animal instinct, a crude, desperate struggle for calories, devoid of the internal complexity that defines us. We are wrong. If you were to take that child, dress them in modern clothes, and place them in a classroom today, they would be indistinguishable from any other. Their brain was the same size as yours. Their capacity for grief, for irony, and for existential dread was already fully formed. 100,000 years ago, humanity wasn't a prototype. It was a finished product, wandering through a world that had no name for them. The silence of that world is difficult for the modern mind to fathom. Today, there is nowhere on Earth truly free from the hum of electricity or the distant thrum of an engine. But 100,000 years ago, the only sounds were the tectonic shifts of the environment, the grinding of glaciers, the hiss of the wind through high yellow grass, and the rhythmic breathing of a landscape that was very much alive. In this world, your senses were not a luxury. They were a high-stakes intelligence network. You could smell the arrival of rain hours before it fell. You could hear the subtle change in a bird's call that signaled a leopard was moving through the undergrowth 300 yards away. You lived in a state of hyper-awareness that we would today diagnose as a profound anxiety disorder. But for them, this tension was the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. The common narrative suggests that our ancestors lived in a state of constant, bloody warfare with nature. But the archaeological record suggests something more unsettling. They lived in a state of deep psychological intimacy with it. In 1991, in a cave overlooking the Indian Ocean, researchers found a workshop. It wasn't a place for butchering meat or sharpening spears. It was a laboratory for chemistry. They found abalone shells used as mixing bowls, containing a complex mixture of liquefied ochre, charcoal, and crushed bone. This was a 100,000-year-old paint factory. This reveals a disturbing truth. Survival was not enough for them. Even in a world where a simple infected scratch could mean an agonizing death, they chose to spend their precious calories on aesthetics. They were decorating their bodies. They were creating symbols. They were beginning to tell stories about themselves. The psychological weight of this transition cannot be overstated. For the first time in the history of the planet, a creature was no longer just reacting to reality. It was trying to rewrite it. But this new power came with a terrifying price. To live 100,000 years ago was to realize that you were not the only person in the woods. We often forget that for the vast majority of our history, Homo sapiens shared the planet with other versions of ourselves. To our north were the Neanderthals, stout, powerful, and deeply adapted to the cold. To the east were the Denisovans. On the islands of Indonesia, a hobbit-like species, Homo floresiensis, moved through the jungles. Imagine the psychological trauma of encountering another being that looks like you, speaks a language you cannot understand, and possesses a mind as complex as your own, yet is fundamentally other. This was not a meeting of cultures. It was a meeting of species. The uncanny valley isn't a modern phenomenon caused by robots. It is an evolutionary scar left over from a time when we weren't the only ones who could think. And yet, despite their strength, they vanished. We stayed. The reason for our survival is often attributed to our tools, but the truth is likely found in our capacity for shared delusion. 100,000 years ago, we began to believe in things that didn't exist. We created myths. We created tribes that extended beyond bloodlines. We invented the concept of us and them. This social cohesion allowed us to dominate, but it also introduced a new kind of horror, the terror of exile. In a world of 100,000 years ago, to be cast out of the group was a psychological death that preceded the physical one. You weren't just losing your food source, you were losing the only thing that made the universe make sense. As the sun set 100,000 years ago, the darkness was absolute. There was no light pollution to soften the stars. You sat around a fire, the only circle of safety in a continent of predators. You looked into the flames, and for the first time, you began to wonder why you were there. You weren't a caveman. You were a person, trapped in the Pleistocene, equipped with a brain designed to solve problems that wouldn't exist for another 100 millennia. You had the hardware of a space traveler, but the reality of a scavenger. We are the descendants of the people who didn't blink when the fire went out. We carry their trauma, their hypervigilance, and their desperate need for belonging in our very DNA. Our modern world is built on the foundations of their fears. When you look at that footprint in the South African sand, you aren't looking at a primitive ancestor. You are looking into a mirror. The child who made that mark is gone, their world is gone, and eventually, our world will be a layer of dust on top of theirs. But the silence they lived in is still there, waiting just beyond the edge of our noise. We didn't conquer the wild, we just built a louder room to hide in.